Hilchis Mikvaos Perik Shmini. Kol ha'mu'urev lemikvah, hareu kemikvah umat bilnbei. Anything that's mixed with the mikvah, knows connected to the mikvah, has a din of a mikvah, and therefore you can be toivel in this place as well, even though this place in itself is not a kosher mikvah, but since it's mu'urev to a mikvah, so therefore it also has a din of a mikvah umat bilnbei. Let me just give a hagdama. There's the shir there's a shir kishveiferes anoid. Literally, shveiferes means like a straw which you drink from, and anoid is a pouch, a water pouch. And as they would have a leather water pouch, and in that leather pouch they would put in a shveiferes, which was a straw and to drink with. So the normal size of that straw, that's the shir of kishveiferes anoid. As the Rambam is going to say later, that it means the two fingers, the first two fingers of the hand, which means the index finger and the middle finger. So if that's the size of the shveiferes anoid. So if you have a hole between two mikvos, and then you'd be able to put the two fingers into the hole and turn it around the hole. And the hole is big enough that two fingers could easily turn around within this hole. So that's the size of a hole which connects two mikvahs. Now there's a difference if you're connecting two bodies of water which are separated by a wall, a full wall. So memela you have the hole inside the wall. So then the height of the hole and the width of the hole both has to be kishveres anoid. Whereas it has to be that you should be able to turn both fingers around this entire hole. Masha'enkin, if you would have a little hole next to the mikvah. So on top, these two, the mikvah and this hole connect. The water connects between this hole, which is right next to the mikvah, and the mikvah itself. The water from the mikvah and the water of the hole connect on top. So now the width of that hole has to be kishveferes anoid. But the height of the hole, since they're connecting on top of the wall, when they're connecting through the wall, so then it has to be the height and the width of this hole has to be kishveferes anoid. Masha'enka, when they're connecting on top of the wall, so then they're connecting, even if it's only kiklipas hashum, and there's a very, very thin layer of garlic, very, very minimalistic amount of water is connecting, but as long as the width of this connection is kishveres anoid is also good. So here we're talking about Lamashal, the first halacha is talking about like you have a little hole next to the top of the mikveh. So really the waters are connecting on top. The water of the mikveh and the water of this little hole which is next to the top of the mikveh is they're connecting on top of each other. They're not going through a wall. But on the other end, the width of this connection has to be shveiferes anoid. Mashenk in the height, there's no minimal shear. As long as they connect on top, that's considered. Now that is if you have a mashal next to a mikveh. So you have a mikveh. Next to the mikveh, you have a place where an animal, the hoof of the animal went into the ground. So you made an indentation in the ground. And that area where this parsa of the behemoth went into is filled with water. So that water is like connecting on the top. There's no wall in between them. They're connecting with the mikveh. So as long as that connection, the width of that connection is kishveferes anoid, that creates a connection. Again, Perik Shmini. Kol ha'mu'urev lemikveh, anything that's connected to the mikveh, that's mixed with the mikveh, connected to the mikveh, hareu kemikveh, it has a din of the mikveh, umat bilnbei. Now the examples are gumois hasmuches lepia mikveh. You have a hole in the ground that's right next to the mikveh. You have a regular mikveh, and next to it you have a little hole next to this mikveh, and this hole, as we said, on the top is connecting to the mikveh. The water of the mikveh and the water of the hole connect on top. Or umikeim ragli parsis behema, or the place where the behemoth was stepped. So again, they made an indentation. Now that area where that step was is filled with water, and it's connecting with the water in the mikveh. Shahayu behamayim, which they had water in this hole, these gumis hasmuchas lepia mikveh, or in these mikeim ragli parsis behema, which were next to the mikveh. Shahayu behamayim muravim imea mikveh kishveferes anoid. And over here, the shear is in the width. The width has to be kishveres anoid. There's no shear of the height, because over here we're talking about they're connecting together. There's no wall in between this connection. They're connecting on top. They're on top of the wall. So therefore, matbil them. So you could be matbil. You could be toivel something in that little hole which is next to the top of the mikveh, and al derezeh you could be toivel something in that indentation that came from the ragli parsis of the behemoth. The ragli parsa of the behemoth, as long as the width of indentation of the width of this hole would be kishviferes haneit. Halacha beis. Now churi ha-mo'ora v'sitki ha-mora. So the first halacha we're talking about that there's a little hole on top, next to the mikveh. There's a little hole, and that hole connects to the mikveh, the place of Mekem Ragli Parsa Beima. Now we have another situation where we have in the mikveh you have a little hole, little cavity in the wall of the mikveh, or a little crack in the wall of the mikveh, and in that crack and in that cavity, the water of the mikveh goes in. Now the question is if that area is also called a mikveh. So we hear churi mikveh, the sitki mikveh. There's the holes which is within the mikveh, in the walls, in cavities which are in the walls of the mikveh itself. Or the sitke, it says ma'ara, the sitke amara, but over here it means a mikveh. Some girses have mikveh. And sometimes a ma'ara means it's a mikveh which is made like a ma'ara. In those, it goes into the ground and it's made in that type of a way. But basically it means a mikveh. Churi ma'ara, the sitke amara, madbil mem, you could be table in them. Aval b'she'ena mayim shebehem, mu'uravim imei mikveh el b'kolshu, even if there's a very minimalistic hole in between them. In other words, you have a small cavity that's going into the wall of the mikveh, and then you bring something in, and that goes into that area. So since that's part of the mikveh, in the case in the first halacha, when we're talking about a chayr, which is next to the mikveh, or became ragli parsa behem, which is next to the mikveh, so then it has to have a kishviferes haneit to connect it to. But over here, since it's a wall within the mikveh, we're talking about a cavity in the wall of the mikveh, or we're talking about a crack in the wall of the mikveh, is aval b'she'ena mayim shebem muravim emei mikveh el b'kolshu. That's also considered part of the mikveh, and therefore you could be table in that little cavity or in that little crack. Halacha gimel. Machat shehoisen nesuna al mailas hamikveh. So you have a needle that's on the steps going down into the mikveh. Now you're afraid basically to put the needle into the mikveh because you're afraid to lose it. So what you want to do is you want to make the water flow. And as you make the water, start causing the water like to be a little bit wavy, and then the water will go over the step, and that water which goes over the step is still connected to the mikveh. Machat shehoisen nesuna al mailas hamikveh. And you were pushing the water back and forth, and the water was becoming wavy to be able to go over the step. Once the wave of this mikveh went over the step, and this machat was covered, is tahira, and it's not a shiloh. There's not a. In other words, if that wave would have become disconnected from the mikveh, so then that would have been a problem. That wouldn't have been no longer part of the mikveh. Over here, the wave is really part of the mikveh. And the fact that it's there's normally b'chlal a mikveh has to be mitayr b'ashberin, not b'zechlin. In other words, the mikveh shouldn't be flowing; it has to be standing in one place, like we'll learn b'hemshech. It has to be standing in one place. But over here, even though this wave is flowing, but since this wave is really connected to the mikveh, which is standing b'ashberin, it's connected to the mikveh. So therefore, there's no problem of the fact that this wave, which is going over the mailas hamayra, is flowing. That's this din. Read again. Machat she'nesuna al mailas hamikveh v'hoya melech u'mevi b'mayim. You were moving the water back and forth in order to get the water to have like a little wave that will go over the step. Kiven she'avar ha'agal. Once the wave goes over the step of the mikveh, is tehera. So this machat is torah. Halacha dalet. Uka shebetech mikveh. Again, you have a hole. Now this time, so we learned about a hole which was on the side of the mikveh on top. We learned about a hole which is in the wall of the mikveh. Now we're learning about a hole that's in the floor of the mikveh. You have a hole that's in the floor of the mikveh, and it has a little cover over it. In other words, it's not as if it's completely exposed, so it's obviously it's part of the mikveh. Over here you have a hole which is not completely exposed, in other words, but there's a hole going, in other words, like a little cavity under the floor of the mikveh. So the question is that considered like part of the mikveh, or is that considered a separate hole, and therefore it has to become connected to the mikveh? So again, if something is mamish part of the mikveh, like we said before, the cavity in the wall of the mikveh and the cracks in the wall of the mikveh, so there's no shear of connection. You don't need a kishviferes haneit. Masha'in kein, if something is a separate entity, like the first halacha, when we're talking about something that's on the side of the mikveh, so the shear to connect is kishviferes haneit. Over here, that's the shaila. And again, the uka, shebetech mikveh, when you have this cavity on the bottom of the mikveh, is that considered a separate entity? And therefore you have to have a connection, and then the shear of the connection is going to be shishveres haneit, Or do we say no, that this cavity is considered part of the mikveh, just like the cavity in the wall of the mikveh, and therefore you don't need to have any shear in the connection. So it depends if the floor on top of this uka is strong enough to hold someone. In other words, if this floor on top of the uka is strong enough to hold someone, so basically it's not part of the mikveh. Since it's not part of the mikveh, so therefore it needs a shriferes haned in order to connect. Mashenkin, if that floor is weak, so maybe someone you stand on top of the floor, so it'll fall in. So maybe it comes out that basically this hole, which is under that floor, is not really considered a separate entity; it's considered part of the mikveh. So therefore, you don't need kishriferes haned. That's the havanas hadvar. Halacha dal. Uka shebetech mikveh. You have a little hole in a mikveh, which is under the mikveh. Im hoisa hakarka hamavdel is bin the uka v'hamikveh bria. If that karka, which was between the uka and the mikveh, was strong, and therefore v'chela lahamedes atzma, it's able to stand, to stand. In other words, stand firmly. It's not something which is going to fall in. Is ein madbilim b'mayim shebuka achiyil murav me'hamikveh kishveres haned. So we look at that mayim shebuka as being mayim in a separate entity, and therefore, in order to connect that mayim with the mikveh, it has to have the shir kishveres haned. However, it's not really strong enough that the floor should stand. Is afila ein murav el bekosho, as long as there's some connection between the mikveh and the uka, and as if they're completely covered, they're completely covered. But as long as there's somewhat of a connection between the mikveh and the uka, there's water connecting between the mikveh and the uka, so then it's madbilmem, you could be table in the uka. Now the Ram doesn't say clearly what's the shir. The Ram says v'yechela lahamed desatzma. It's something which could hold itself. In other words, it's not something which is about to fall in. It doesn't say clearly if a person stands on it, is it going to fall? It's not so clear what's the shir of v'yechela lahamed desatzma. Halacha koisel shebein shnei mikvois shenizdak. You have a koisel, a wall between two mikvois, and there is a crack that goes along the entire wall. It goes along the entire wall. So you can have a vertical crack, a crack that goes vertically, and you can have a crack that goes la'ariv, that's the horizontal crack. Now when it goes a vertical crack, so we can assume that once the wall cracked all the way from the top to the bottom vertically, so it'll eventually completely fall apart. So therefore it's oimid to fall apart. So therefore, even if there's no kishveferes haned, that's already enough to be able to connect the two mikvahs. Mashenkin, when you have a crack which is horizontal, so since the top, in other words, the top half of the wall is resting on top of the lower half of the wall, and they're resting, in other words, the weight of the top half of the wall is connecting to the lower part of the wall, so we assume that it's not really going to fall apart so quickly. And therefore, this crack doesn't create a connection unless it's the size of a kishveres haned. That's this din. Halacha koisel shebein shnei mikvois shenizdak l'shesi. If you have a wall in between two mikvois that was split, there was a crack vertically, is mitzdarfen. They're talking about the entire wall got cracked. However, and therefore, they're mitzdarfen, and therefore, if together there was arboim so in the two of them, is matbil b'cholachem. You could be matbil in each one. Each one, even though each one is less than 40 saw, but together the 40 saw, they considered one mikvah. However, if they were, the crack wasn't vertically, but it was horizontal, so then emet starfen, the namet starfen, as we said, because since it's horizontal, so we assume that it's going to stay because the weight of the top half will rest on the lower half and keep it together. Is emet starfen achiyeh b'mokem echad kishriferes haned, unless there's a hole of a shriferes haned which will connect the two, which then it would help without a crack. Now nifratz hakoisel milmaila. If the koisel there was a opening in the wall on top, the top part of the wall is in this arvu hamayim l'mayla min hakesel keklipas hashum al rechev kishriferes hanud mitzdarfen. That's really what we mentioned in the first halacha. In other words, when you have a crack, when you have a hole in the wall itself, so then the hole has to be the size of a shveres haned, side the height of the hole, and side the width of the hole. Masha'inkin, when you have a connection between two mikvois on the top of the wall, there's like a part of the wall, a little part of the wall on top, let's say broke, and therefore now there's a connection between the water on top of the wall. So Memela, since they're connecting not through a wall, they're connecting on top of the wall, so there's no height. There's no shear to the height of their connection. That connection could be even Klipas Hashum. But on the other hand, there's a shear to the width of their connection. The width of their connection has to be Kishriferes Haneit. Mashengen, the height of their connection, which the height of their connection is not going through a wall, so then even if it's Klipas Hashum, that also creates connection. Now, Kamu Shir Anekev Shriferes Haneit, when we say Shriferes Haneit, which again is the straw of a pouch which you drink water from. That the shear of the Shriferes Haneit is Bereich of Shtei Etzbois, Bein Nishal Kolodom, the width of the two fingers of a regular two fingers of a regular person, and V'chezes Bei, and those two fingers should be able to turn around in that hole. If you have those two fingers that could turn around in the hole, that's the size of Shriferes Haneit. The Einon Begudel, we're not talking about thumbs. Normally when we speak about an etzba, we talk about a gudel, but over here we're not talking about the gudel. Ela Shtei Etzbois Rishenis, the first two fingers, min ha'arba shebepas hayad, from the four fingers which are on the palm of the hand. So the first two fingers, which is the index finger, and the middle finger from the four fingers which are on the pas hayad, these are the two fingers which have to go into the hole and to be able to turn around in this hole. Now, that's the din of Shriferes Haneit. Now that I'm saying another halach. Kol shiyamid b'shriferes haneit. When you're saying you have two mikvos, and those two mikvos are being connected with a hole which is the size of a shriferes haneit. Now, what happens if you have something which is in that hole, something which is in the hole itself, and it was in the area of the hole, so that whatever's standing over there is blocking the connection. In other words, you have to have a connection of a shriferes haneit. If you have something that's standing in the airspace of this hole, so then it's stopping that connection of Shriferes Haneit. Kol sheyamid b'shriferes haneit. Anything that's standing in the Shriferes Haneit, memat. V'afilu b'dvarim shemibriyasi shalmayim. Even something that's created from the water, which we'll soon learn that something that's mibriyasi shalmayim, you could even be toivel in it. So it has a din of mayim. But nevertheless, mayim, which flows, the water which is in this Shriferes Haneit, since it's flowing water, so that's not blocking. That's the connection. The connection is through the water. Masha'enkin, when you have something which is, even though it's mibriyasi shalmayim, but it's not mayim, and it's standing there, so that would block the connection. That would prevent that these two mikvahs should be considered connected. Kol sheyamid b'shriferes haneit, anything that stands in that area is memayit. V'afilu b'dvarim shemibriyasi shalmayim, even something that was created from water. Now, safik yesh b'nefkev shriferes haneit, safik she'en bei. So then, ein mitzdarf. So this din of being mitzar of the two mikvahs is al chadiraisa dikadin. It's negated to chadiraisa dikadin, whether the mikvah is a kosher mikvah. So maybe if there's a suffix, whether this connection is a good connection, is a mitzarf and the not mitzarf. You have to be vaday that there's a connection. Why? So the Rambam says the chalal, the rule is the sveika deiraisa b'natera. Sveika deiraisa is l'chumra, and sveika derabbanan is l'kula. And generally, the Rambam holds that things that are divrei kabbalah, which means, in other words, even things that are halachal meish misinai, goes into together of midivrei seifrim. So l'chura, since the shir of shriferes haneit, the halachal meish misinai, so l'chura would go into together of divrei seifrim, and maybe it should be a klal of safik derabbanan l'kula. So on that the Rambam says, the whole musik of being table is the minatera dikin. It's not a musik derabbanan. It's a minatera dikin. The chol sheikri minatera, something which is neged to a minatera dikadin. Afal pi shiuri halacha, the shear which is neged to this minatera dikadin is the halacha meish misinai, is safik shiur lechachmer. So in other words, when you have something which is a halacha meish misinai in a Torah dikazach, a halacha meish misinai in a Torah dikazach, so then we say that safik deiraisa lechumra. So in other words, even though the Ram Pashas Advarim is that if you're talking about a suffix in something which is ikri halacha mishmi sinai, so then taka lav dafka it'll be sveika deiraisa l'chumra, because it doesn't have a din of a deiraisa. Since it's a suffix in a halacha, which a halacha mishmi sinai, and the whole thing is yisod is halacha mishmi sinai, so then we would say l'kula. Masha'inkin, if something which is a be'etzem a deiraisa dike issue, it's just the question is that this deiraisa dike issue, this is a shear in a deiraisa dike issue, so then you say sveika deiraisa l'chumra. Now they bring the Mefarshim bring that Those even things that are ikre in halacha mishmisina, it also doesn't mean dafka that it has to be lekula. It means over there it could be lekula. No, the rule is sveika deiraisa is always lechumra. So since sveika deiraisa lechumra, so when you have a halacha mishmisina in a deiraisa, so then we'll also go lechumra. If you have a halacha mishmisina which is not a halacha mishmisina in a deiraisa, so then it depends. Sometimes the chacham were machmer, and sometimes the chacham weren't machmer. They bring when you get treifis. There's certain treifis we say that sveika lechumra, certain we say lekula, and over there also it's halacha mishmisina the treifis. And nevertheless, we see that sometimes we go lechumra. Why? Why do we go lechumra? The whole thing is a halacha mishmisina. The answer is because there's no hechrich that a halacha mishmisina should go lekula. Pshat is that halacha mishmisina, which is in a deraisa, there's a hechrich that it should go lechumra. Halacha zayin mitarin is a mikvois ha'elyin min ha'tachten v'harochik min ha'korav. So till now we're talking about that you have two mikvahs next to each other, or some water next to a mikvah, and then the question is that they should become mu'uriv through a shviferes haned, which is in the wall between these two places of water. Now over here we're talking about a mikvah that there's no hole in between them. You have a mikvah which in one mikvah has 40 saw, the other mikvah doesn't have 40 saw, and you want to be machshir the mikvah that doesn't have 40 saw, that it should become connected to the mikvah that has 40 saw. And here we're going to learn that you could connect it through a pipe. The fact that you connect a pipe between the mikveh that has 40 saw and the mikveh that doesn't have 40 saw, and since that pipe doesn't have a din of a keli, so that could connect the two mikvahs, and the mele, both mikvahs, even the mikveh that doesn't have 40 saw, should have a din of a kosher mikveh. Halacha zayin. Metarin is a mikvahs ha'elyin min ha'tachten. Because you have an upper mikveh which doesn't have 40 saw, and the lower one does have 40 saw. So you can retire the upper one from the lower one. As they bring Pirush HaMishnah says that kol shkein, you can be retire the tachten from the elyon. In other words, the chidush is ha'elyon and tachten. In other words, the laws of gravity are going from the elyon to the tachten. Over here, you're being retire the elyon from the tachten. But you certainly could be retire the tachten from the elyon. And also the harachik min ha'korav, you can have a mikveh that's distant and this is closer, and you could connect the two mikvahs. And the chidush is that you could rely that connection is still intact. Sometimes you make a connection, so since this is Rachik, and this is Karev, they're far from each other, so therefore there would be a Svarim. Maybe it was Nifsek, maybe someone made a Hefsek in between. The Chiddush is that we're not Choshish that there was a Hefsek. Nachamal, Halacha Zayin, Mitarin is a mikvahs, Ha'elyim and Ha'tachten, the higher mikvah from the lower mikvah, and B'harachik ben Ha'karev, the further mikvah from the one that's closer. Closer means closer to the issue, or closer to where you started from. I'll call why is one knows this is a further place and this is Karev, and nevertheless you could connect the two mikvahs. Case Nevin silan shel. You bring a pipe that's made out of earthenware, a shalavar, or made out of lead, ukietzmem, any type of a pipe. She'ena silenis peselis hamikvah. The seal in a pipe doesn't have a din of a keli because it's not a makabel, it's not osil kabbalah, it's not metal kabbalah. So therefore, ena silenis peselis hamikvah. Now you put the sealant into the mikvah, you connect the sealant to the mikvah, uminiach es yadav tachtav, and you put your hand on the bottom of the sealant, achi ismali maim, you want that this pipe should be filled with water. So you have a pipe that's sticking into a mikvah, and that pipe is filled with water. And now umoishcha, you schlep the pipe, umashike, and you connect this pipe to the other mikvah, achi is arev hamayim shebesilin, and now the water in the pipe, which is connected to one of those mikvahs, should become connected to the other mikvah. So you have this pipe. It doesn't make a difference if you're taking the pipe that's from the kosher to the one that's not kosher, or the other way. The kudas advarim is that you're connecting the two mikvahs. So you take a pipe. Let's say this case over here, the tachten and elyon, the elyon and tachten. You want to be matayr the elyon and tachten. So you're taking the pipe and the elyon, which is really the one you want to be matayr, and then you fill up that pipe. The pipe becomes filled with water, and then you connect it with the tachten. And afilu kesaira, even if that connection is a very minimalistic connection, and that's dayah. Both mikvahs become like one mikvah, and memela, since one of them is kosher, so the other one is also kosher. That's this din. Now the mice is this two chidushim here in this din. One din is we're going to learn b'hamshach. First of all, until now we're learning that in order to connect two mikvois, you have to have kishviferes haneit. And over here the Rambam is saying that even as kisayra diet, or even a connection of kisayra diet. So the mice is that the Rash in Mishnayos, so Hitaka says that be'emes normally you need kishviferes haneit, but over here you're only being matayr. He says you're being matayr only this is Maim Shuvim. Maim Shuvim is only a Drabonon Dikach Psul. So for that, Drabonon Dikach Psul is enough. Also a Kisaira. Kisaira is Daya. In those Bamas, if it would be a problem of a mikveh that doesn't have the shear, so then this shear of Kisaira would, the minimalistic shear wouldn't be enough. You'd need Kishviferes Haneit. That's what the Rash says. But the Mice is the Rambam Pirish Mishnai doesn't learn like that. The Pash is the learning that this Rambam means even if one of the mikvahs don't have a shear, the Rambam doesn't say it clearly, but even when the mikvah doesn't have a shear, so now you need the connection on the Raisodika level, and nevertheless, this connection could be affected by this ceiling, this pipe, which is only Kisaira, only the connection, the water that's going from one to the other is only Kisaira, and that's diet. That's one chiddush over here. And another chiddush is that we're going to learn Behemshach that water to connect one mikveh to another mikveh, it can't be zeichel and it can't be flowing water. It has to be standing water. And therefore we're going to have a case where you have like an area which is like an incline, and now you have two mikvahs and you want to connect it with water that's flowing from one to the other. But since that water is not bi'ashbein, it's not standing, it's zeichel and it's moving, so therefore they don't really connect. And over here, so it has two chisreinis over here. One chisaron is that it's first of all it's only a mashu, and secondly it's only a kesaira. And another question is that l'chura it's not ashbein, it's zeichel, and nevertheless it works. So it brought down that when it connects naturally, so then it has to be taka bashbein, and then it has to be kishviferes haneit. Masha'inkin, when you go ahead and make the connection, and those you're working on this connection, or you're taking the sila and you're making the connection between the elyon and the tachton. So b'chiyah gavna, there's no problem even if it's kesaira, and also there's no problem if it's not bashbein, it's zeichlin. So davar chodesh. But that's l'chura where it comes out from this halacha. Halacha ches, shalish gumei shebenachal. You have three holes in a wadi, and it's not a straight, they're flowing, and there's water flowing down this nachal, and you have three gumis in it. Hatachtene v'holyene shel esem so, the higher one and the lowest one are both 20 saw, v'emtsois, and the middle hole is arboim, shel arboim. And v'shetev shel kshamim, and you have a flow of rainwater, over b'techa nachal is going through this one. Is afal pisho nichnas l'techam v'yetzim mitecham, even though this flow of rainwater is going through the first, it's going from the first guma to the second guma to the third guma. In other words, they're connecting, this flow of rainwater is l'chura connecting all three gumas. Nevertheless, ein ze'irov, that's not considered a connection, and therefore ve'ein matbilin ele b'emtsois. So even though you have three holes, and the svara is that since there's a flow of water connecting all three gumas, so in Mela, all three gumas become like one mikveh, and you could be toivel in any one. So we say no, that this flow of rainwater is not connecting the mikvahs. Why not? In other words, zeichelin, water that's flowing, cannot connect mikvahs. In order to connect the mikvah, you have to have standing water. So when you have standing water, two mikvahs which are standing, and there's a hole in between, so that becomes a connection. Masha'inkin, in the case where over here there's water that's flowing, is flowing from the top to the bottom, so the middle mikvah, which is 40 saw, you could be toivelin. But the other two mikvahs, which each one has 20, and they're only connected by this shetev of kshamim, so since the shetev shel kshamim is zeichlim, so therefore it doesn't affect the connection. That was the kasha that we asked before, that l'chura the silon is also yikataina zeichlim. It's not so clear that l'chura from the elyon to the tachton, so you can say it's zeichlim, this silon is zeichlim. So why is it a connection? So the answer is again, because like we said before, that since over here you're affecting the connection, so therefore it works even if it's zeichlim, and even if it's kisaira, which normally you need a connection of kishviferes haneit. Halacha tes. Titrach shahapora shoicha v'shoisim imenu. In other words, you have loose mud, where the parah could drink from it. It's loose mud, it's soft mud, it's not thick mud. So it's mostly water, a lot of water, it's like liquidy. So the din is hareza nibdad in a mikvah. So this mud, this titrach, could add to the 40 saw of the mikvah. However, hoya ava, if it's thick mud, ach ein apara sheikha v'sheisa, ein nimdad dime. So you know you have to have 40 saw of water. Now, if part of those 40 saw is mud, it depends. If it's loose mud, where a parah would go drink from this mud, so then that adds to the share of the mikvah. And if it's thick mud, it doesn't add to the share of the mikvah. That's the number one. Halacha yud, mikvah sheyesh be arboim saw mayim v'tit. It has water and tit, that's both the 40 saw. So the din is madbilin betit ube mayim. So then you could go ahead and be tovel in the tit and in the mayim. Now this obviously is talking about titrach. We're talking about titrach because we're talking about it's adding to the 40 saw. So we're talking about titrach, and you could be tovel signing the mayim and signing the tit. However, be'ezeh tit madbilin, when could you be tovel in the tit? Only betit harach shamayim tzofen al gabav. In other words, titarach is not enough. You has to have that there's water on top of the titarach. And the reason for it is because when you walk into the mikveh and you went into the water which was over the titarach, so even though takal mashal, your feet went into the titarach, but since your feet first went into the water, so your feet became wet, and the moisture in your feet, which is in the titarach, is connected to the rest of the mikveh, and therefore you're being tovel in water. You're being tovel in water. Titarach can be mashal in the mikveh, but you can't be tovel in titarach. However, if you were tovel in the water, now there's the water on your feet, and that water on your feet is still connected to the water which is in the mikveh. So mele it comes out that you were tovel in the water. You were tovel in the water. Now the emphasis we're going to learn behemshach that this din is even by tit ha'ava. In other words, tit ha'ava can't be mashal in the mikveh. But on the other end, if you put your foot, there's tit ha'ava in the mikveh. The bottom of the mikveh has thick mud. Now you put your feet into, you go into the mikveh, you stand in the mikveh, so your feet first goes into the water. So maybe your feet becomes wet. So even though now your feet are sinking into the tit ha'ava, but lapel, since your feet are wet, so the moisture that's on your feet is connected to the water which is in the mikveh. So the difference between titarach and tita'ava is only titarach could be mashal the share of the mikveh. Tita'ava cannot be mashal share of the mikveh. But both of them you can't really be tovel in. You could only be tovel in them only if there was water. So memela, then the water, so your feet became wet, and the water which are around your feet is mechuber to the water in the mikveh. So legabi that prat, there's the difference between nachmal. The difference between tita'av and titarach is only whether they're mashal the shir of mikveh. But as far as being tovel, you could be tovel in titarach only on the condition that there was water, and you could be tovel in tita'av also on the condition that there was water. The difference is only in tita'ach, even if that's mashal darboim so is enough. In tita'av it can't be mashal darboim so. Let's read it again. Mikveh halacha yud. Mikveh sheyesh be'arboim so mayim betit. Madbilin betitu b'mayim, it could be tovel in the tit and in the mayim, or be'ezeh tit madbilin betitarach shamayim tzofen al gabav, only betitarach where the water is flowing on top of the tit. Hoyu amayim mitzadechot v'tit harach mitzadacher is only madbilin b'mayim b'lei betit. You could not be tovel in the tit harach, even though the tit harach is mashim to the shira mikvah. But if the tit harach is mitzadechot and you want to put, let's say, your foot into the tit harach, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. Halacha Yudalef. Kol shetchilas briyosim in amayim, something that was created from water, kegen yavchushin adumim, certain types of little insect that red yavchushim, things that grow in the water, is madbilan, but you could be tovel in these yavchushim. And also madbilan the initial dog. The initial dog has like certain fats, and that fats like could disintegrate, and therefore you have like something that's liquidy that you could actually be tovel. So memela you could be tovel in initial dog, because initial dog has a din of mine. Halacha Yud Beis. Mikvah sheyesh be arboim so michuvanis. You have a mikvah which is exactly 40 so. Now v'yordu shrayim v'tovel zachar zeh. Two people went in with table, one after the other. So the first person that went in was table. There was 40 so. The problem is that when that person went out of the mikvah, so a little bit of water went out with him, and that little bit of water caused that the mikvah should no longer have 40 so. Is afal pi sheragliv shel rishon neges b'mayim, even though his feet are still touching the water. So l'chura, let's say that all the water that's on his body, which is causing that there should be less than 40 saw, is connected to the mikveh, because lepel, his feet are connected to the mikveh. So then is Harishon Torah. The first one is Taka Torah because he went in, there was 40 saw. The second one is considered Tomei. Shari Chosru Hamayim Arboim Saw, and the water that's on him through the fact that his feet are connected to the mikveh is not considered a connection. The Machlekes, the Mishnah says a connection about it, Negea Godasik, also Negea, or Katafris, but I'll quote upon him. The din is, the Rambam is paskening that when a person walks out, even though all the water that came out of the mikveh is l'chura connected through the fact that his feet are still touching the water of the mikveh, but nevertheless, that's not considered a connection, and therefore the mikveh is considered a mikveh chaser. Now, hitbul bei tchila sogis ava, you have like a piece of cloth that's made out of wool, very thick wool, so it's very absorbent, and now you would toivel this absorbent piece of clothes, and now you started taking out this thick piece of clothes from this mikveh that has exactly our boim saw. If part of this sagas, or part of this thick piece of clothes is still touching the water, because then the water which is absorbed in this keli, because part of the keli is still connected to the mikveh, is considered that it's still part of the mikveh. The water that's on the person that is flowing down is not considered part of the mikveh. That's not considered part of the mikveh, because the water is not really connected to the mikveh. It's like going down the body in order for it to connect it to the mikveh. So that would be like a katafras. Masha'in kain, the sogis, which is it's a thick piece of material and it's absorbed with water, and basically it's all connected to the mikveh. And since part of it is still connected to the mikveh, so therefore the hareya tevel b'achrei nator, because considered that there's still the shear. Sharia mayim kulam murav, because all the water in the sogis is considered mu'urav to the mikveh. Now hitbul beis hamitu kietzvei. You have a mikveh. This is again to what we spoke about the tit. You have a bed that you want to put into the mikveh. Now lepel, the bed is too high for the water of the mikveh. So the way you're going to get the bed into the mikveh is you're going to have to push the legs of the bed into the mud which is on the bottom of the mikveh. So hitbul beis hamitu kietzvei afal b'shedochak ragle hamita betit ove shebekarka mikveh. In order to get the bed into the mikveh, you'd have to push the legs of the bed down into the thick tit which is on the bottom of the mikveh, until the water covered the mikveh, the bed on top. Is harezu tahira. I lechura tita ova is not considered part of the mikveh. Sharei linitbu betita shetavel b'mayim tchila. In order before they actually reached the tit, they immersed in water, and since they immersed in water, so the word is not because the tefillah in water. Tefillah l'machzah is not a tefillah. It means to say it became wet. And since it became wet, so the moisture which is on those legs are in the tita'ava is connected to the moisture which is on top of the tita'ava. So basically, we said before, there's really no difference between tita'ava and tita'arach legabi being toivel. If what you're being toivel is wet, so you could be toivel in either. If what your toivel is not wet, so you can't be toivel in either. And the only difference is only the tita'ava is not mitzdarif to the mikveh. Masha'inkin, the titarach is mitzdarif to the shear of the mikveh. Hitbul be yerig daily. You have again, we're talking about all these dinim are a mikveh, sheyesh be arboim som b'chuvanis. So now you put in a large pot into this mikveh. Now we learned before, you can't put the large pot with the opening downwards, because then the opening won't be filled with water, because it'll be it'll be a pocket of air. And also there's a concern that water is going to come out. If you're going to start pushing the pot down this way, so water is going to start coming out of the mikveh. Even if you start putting it down with the bottom in first, also water is going to start spritzing out of the mikveh. So the eitzah is, hitbul be'yerig dela, is harezu tmeya, so the yerig dela, this pot is going to remain tummy, it's not going to become tired, since you started with exactly 40 saw, so we can assume that the water spritzed out. So by the time this pot actually was immersed in the mikveh, was completely covered in the mikveh, so there was no longer 40 saw. So Ketzid Yasa, what's the eight? So you have a mikveh which is exactly 40 saw, and you have this large pot that you want to be table, is merida derech pia. So you start pulling it down through the mouth, or you turn it upside down, but v'hoifcha b'mikvah, you start turning it over. In other words, you put it in slowly into the mikvah, and you make sure that the mikvah should fill up the entire pot. So you have to put it in through the mouth, and then you start turning it over while it's going into the mikvah, and to make sure that, and then eventually it'll be completely immersed in the mikvah. You can't turn it over and keep the water in that pot, because then that water is going to become mayim shuvim, and then when you can put mayim shuvim back into the mikvah, as we learned before. So in over here, you have to make sure that the water is connected to the mikvah, and that the pot is going in. And then you toivel the pot while the opening is towards the top. And then, however, when you start taking out the pot, you have to turn it back over while it's in the mikvah. Because you're going to start taking it up with the opening of the pot upwards. So as soon as you pull the pot out of the mikvah, all the water that's in that pot is going to become mayim shuvim. And then the outside of the mikvah, they'll go back to the mikvah v'yifsalu. So in order for the mikvah to remain a kosher mikvah, and the pot should be able to be toivel and 40 saw, this date so to put it in, to start putting it in through the mouth and turning it over sideways and being toivel it, and then before you take it out, you turn it back over. Halacha Yud Gimel, mikvah shemeimav miru dodim. You have a mikvah which the water is very shallow, and memela your person can't be toivel himself in the mikvah, in other words, the mikvah won't be able to cover his entire body. So the eitzah is kevesh afilu chavil kashim, afilu v'chavil kanim, b'teicha mayim amin atzlodim. You put things into the water. You put bundles of reeds. You put all kinds of things into the water in order to elevate the water. You put in chavil kashim and chavil kanim to elevate the water. Achi arma hamayim l'mayla, until the water will become elevated, so you'll be able to go in and be table. And v'yedid v'table l'techem, then you could go in and be table l'techem. So even though the mikveh in its natural state right now, you could not, it's too shallow for you to be able to be table. If you lie down in it, the water is not going to cover you. So the eitzah is to put bundles of things inside the water, on the side of the water, and then that water will start going up, it will become higher, and then you'll be able to be table in the mikveh.